Hi everyone, my name is Matt, and welcome to my channel. I picked up some Tomb Kings for Warhammer the Old World, and I've been sitting on them for a while. The skeleton kit is pretty old, and it looks dated, and the models are relatively plain. I want to make my army unique, and I figured this would be a great opportunity to make some simple press molds. I'll sculpt some original parts, make molds, and then cast a bunch of copies to equip the whole regiment. So grab some putty, and let's get sculpting. First thing I need to do is sculpt some parts. I'll be using this 2-part epoxy putty, commonly known as green stuff. Mix about equal amounts of blue and yellow, and then you have about half an hour of working time before it starts to cure. If you want a more in-depth look at the sculpting process, check out this video here. Even though the basic skeleton warriors don't have any armor in the rules, I like the look of these collars and loincloth parts on the chariot crew. I'll make some parts similar to those, as well as a few scraps of armor. A piece of plasticard will work great as a base for sculpting. I started out the collar with a flat, round shape, dipping my tools in water to prevent them from sticking to the putty. Then I made an opening in the center and rounded it out. I referenced the plastic piece as needed so I could make sure to get the size right. I pressed a few guidelines at equal distances and then worked some triangle shapes all around. After that was done, I rolled out a thin coil of putty and put it all around the edge. Make sure the details are cut pretty deep, because the stamp molds can't really pick up fine details very well. The simpler and more obvious, the better. After the main shapes are worked out, I like to go back and forth between a couple different tools and refine the shapes. I want to make some shoulder armor as well, and that started out with a small blob of putty. I think it's much easier to shape the putty by gently pushing the tools into it, rather than dragging or pulling kinds of motions. This stuff is really sticky, and if you push too hard or if your tool isn't wet enough, it'll end up sticking. After a while, you'll get a feel for it. I made a few simple marks and a geometric kind of design, easy textures for the mold to pick up. Then I refined the edges. I'll make a couple loincloth shapes, and I think the first one will be a simple cloth design. I measured out the rough shape, and then pressed it down with a spoon-shaped tool and made the surface smooth and even. Then I added a couple vertical folds using a color shaper tool, and then a few textures here and there. I want to put a simple scarab design on the front of the collar piece, and now that the first portion is cured, I can work on details like that. I started out with a small amount of putty, and then smoothed it out. Then I added a couple simple lines to define the wing shape. I'm not going to sculpt any tiny details like legs on the scarab, because the mold won't be able to pick it up anyway. Next I worked on a couple small cloth pieces. Starting off with a small piece, I pushed the putty into a rough crescent-looking shape. Then I used a couple of tools to push it around and refine the edges. I like using the rubber color shaper tool to make the folds. Once I was happy with the cloth parts, I let them cure. I'm going to add some scale armor on top of them, and it'll be much easier to sculpt that with a solid base. Scale mail is pretty easy to sculpt. Start off with a thin layer of putty, and make sure it's smooth and even. Then make a few evenly spaced horizontal lines for each row of scales. Push the top of each row down so it looks like it's being overlapped by the row above it. Don't worry about individual scales at first, just focus on getting the big shapes right. Refine the edges of each row as needed. I like to think of them as long shingles or the siding on a house. Once the shapes look right, then you can go in and make the individual scales. Alternate where the lines are on each row. When all the scales are marked out, I like to go back with the color shaper tool and round out the bottom edges. I like to gently run the tool over the top of each scale as well. It kind of presses down the middle a bit and flares out the edges. Then I went back with a knife and carved some deeper lines between a few of the scales. I went back and forth between the different tools as needed until I was happy with the results. I left all the parts to cure overnight, and now it's time to make some molds of them. First I need to put some grease on the parts so the mold can come off. Lip balm and an old brush work great. Coat each piece with a small amount and make sure to get it in all the details. Using firm pressure, push some fresh putty into the part, and then leave it to cure overnight. Once it's cured, you can peel it off, and if you did it right, you should have a nice impression. I like to go around the edge of the piece and sharpen it. Just make sure you don't cut into the impression itself. When you sharpen the edge of the mold, it'll do a few things. It will help ensure that excess putty can more easily flow outward, and the piece will cast at the right thickness, and it will also produce a cleaner edge. I like to take some extra putty and make a handle on the back side of the mold. Once that cures, I like to carve an undercut on the handle too. It makes it easier to grab and push. Now for the casting process. A sheet of plasticard works great for this as well. Take a small blob of putty and stick it to the plasticard. Use your best guess to determine how much you need, and once you make a few of them, you'll get a good idea for the amount. Brush a little more lip balm into the mold, and wet the surface of the putty to be cast. Push down on the mold with plenty of pressure. I like to wiggle it a little bit too. Take the mold off and see how the cast looks. If it's not a good cast, just scrape it up and try again. If the cast does look good, move on to the next one and just keep repeating until you run out of putty. I like to collect any excess putty and use it again. You can get quite a few more casts this way. While the putty is still fresh, I like to go in and make some marks on the cloth parts. Some rips and some tears for extra variety. For the collar pieces, I was having a tough time getting the neck shape to cast right. I found it easiest to make a donut kind of shape first. I put down a ball of putty, and then used a brush handle to open up a circle. I matched that up with the mold, and then pushed it down. Once all the pieces are cast, just leave them to cure before peeling them off. Then they're just like any other piece for your model kits. Clean up the mold lines, and then glue them on with super glue. The collars needed some special timing to get right. Since these have to get bent over the shoulders, I needed to trim the parts and glue them down after the putty was cured, but while it was still flexible. I cast these parts in the morning and glued them to the models in the late afternoon. Green stuff putty tends to be relatively flexible, but it'll keep getting more brittle as time goes on, and bending an older piece this much would risk cracking. I tried to vary the placement of all the parts. Some models got more than others. I made a couple different shoulder pads, but they didn't really work out very well. There wasn't a big enough gap to fit the piece in, and they just required too much work to get right. I made a couple belt buckle icons to place over the loincloth, and you may notice a little tribute to a certain card game. You can't talk about ancient pharaohs without mentioning it. These were a lot of fun to do. I haven't done much sculpting lately, and I really enjoyed working on something different. I'm looking forward to building and converting the rest of this army. It'll take a while since I'm juggling a lot of different things, but I think that's the great thing about this hobby. There's always something fun to work on. I hope you enjoyed this and learned a thing or two. Give it a shot and add some character to your armies. If you have an idea for a future video, drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, so you don't miss out on any new content. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy sculpting and happy painting.